Good morning and welcome to Daylight Church Online. We're just so thankful that you're joining us this morning and hope that you have a great experience. We want to let you know that if you'll go to mydaylightchurch.com, there's a card there that says Online Church. And on the Online Church card, it'll tell you everything you need to know about being a part of our online church community, how you can get involved in small groups, how you can give financially, how you can be involved in the service projects that we do. So even if you're in Kansas or Cambodia, you can sure join us and be a part of our church. We'd like you to check it out there and introduce yourself. So go to mydaylightchurch.com and check out the online church card. Thanks. Good morning, Daylighters. I want to start off by saying hi to a friend, Meg Botts, who's in the room. Where's Meg? Meg's in the back corner over here, and she filled in on drums for us this morning. She's been a longtime friend of Daylight, runs an incredible ministry, and also sat with me for about 13 hours one week and designed our logo. So she's the logo. If you like the logo, it's her fault. If you don't like the logo, it was my fault. But make sure and ask her about her ministry on the way out the door. So love you, Meg. Thanks for being here. I have a ton to say and very little time to say it, so I'm going to talk really fast today if that's okay, and you guys can strap in, and here we go. You ready? So I grew up in this little church in Paducah, Kentucky called St. Paul Lutheran Church. And at St. Paul Lutheran Church, we studied what was called Luther's Small Catechism. And that was a part of our confirmation as Christians. And confirmation was a program that you go through for 2 years. You'd study Luther's catechism and basically memorize the answers in the catechism and present those memorized answers in front of the congregation. And after presenting those memorized answers and being prayed for and kind of commissioned, then you were allowed to take the Holy Eucharist, or communion. And so I want to show you some of the questions. It's on the Ten Commandments, the creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creeds, the Lord's Prayer, Holy Baptism, Confession, Communion, and then general instruction. And it's about a 60-page document, and the format goes like this. There's a question, and then it literally says in brackets, answer. And you were expected to memorize these answers, and then when the pastor during your confirmation would ask you, what sins should we confess? And you were expected to recite the answer. Now, this is something, what sins should we confess? This is a deep question, and there's a lot of nuance to these words. What does sin mean? What does confession mean? To me, it's a lot deeper than just what sins should we confess? Well, here's your answer. This is the answer you should memorize. But the answer here was before God, we should plead guilty of all sins, even those of which we do not know, as we do in the Lord's Prayer. But before the confessor, we should confess those sins alone, which we know and feel in our hearts. And it's a solid answer, and I'm not against this type of format, but I want to point out something, that I was expected to recite the correct answers before I could be involved in communion, something communal, the community, the shared bread and wine of the church. And I remember having all kinds of questions of my own that weren't found in Luther's catechism and feeling kind of awkward about those questions. And I remember asking specifically, so here's the building. The bottom left portion of that red, almost T-shaped building is the gymnasium. And off the left side of that gymnasium is a kitchen. And they called it the fellowship hall, the gymnasium. And I was standing in the kitchen one day and I queried this question to one of the church leaders that I respected and still respect tremendously. I asked him, I remember leaning against the cabinets as an 8th grader and asking this question: why should I believe all this stuff? Why should I believe the Bible came from God when it was written by man? Why should I believe a dead man came back to life? Why should I believe this, that, and the other? And I remember his answer, the answer to my query came like this. He said, H, you just have to accept these things by faith. And I've shared this story many times in this congregation, but I remember walking away so disappointed and so just feeling like either nobody knew the answers or I wasn't allowed to ask the right answers. And so you'll see that I was expected to ask the right questions, and I was expected to have the right answers in order to be fully engaged in the community. And I'm not against simple Q&A, but we were taught that the answers were supplied to us. And not only were the answers supplied to us, but the questions were given to us. So then I went to college, and this was Murray State University, and that white building right there in the middle is the Curris Center, where I spent countless hours of my life, and I spent countless hours in there asking questions of my spiritual leaders. And I lived in a house up in the top left corner of that. You can barely see it there in the corner. But I found some people who weren't necessarily afraid of questions. And so I was able to reiterate my question, why should I believe all this stuff? And I found that they had answers. And this was quite liberating for me, but the longer I was involved, the more I found out that the answers were pretty simplistic. The answers were pretty definitive. And I remember the vibe of, if you didn't, so you you were allowed to ask the questions and you were allowed to explore, but then once the answer was supplied, you were expected to embrace that answer and kind of question no further. And the ones involved in our ministry that asked further questions were considered the rebels. And so there was a certain amount of pseudo-intellectualism that went on, but then there was also a certain amount of control that went on. And I'm not saying that a pastor shouldn't talk about doctrine, which obviously even this sermon is in some sense talking about doctrine. But what I am saying is, once again, I was faced with this issue that by asking the wrong questions or being unsatisfied with answers, I was placed in a separate category. It was a communal response. It was about being involved in the community. And I happen to be the poster child for this organization for a very long time, and in some sense, I regret a lot of the choices I made back then and a lot of the stances I held. But I eventually moved away to start Daylight Church here in Louisville, and we started Daylight Church. I came here in 2012, 2013, and we launched soon after. And I lived here at Orchard Lake subdivision. That's Orchard Lake. My house is 6 or 7 houses removed from that lake, and I used to go walk that lake. But right before we started Daylight, one of my spiritual leaders from Murray State University came to visit me. And we had a very, very heated conversation right there in that house about me asking all the wrong questions. And the vibe kind of, so I had begun to question hell and the existence of eternal conscious torment and questions about sexuality and cosmology and sin and the atonement and all the stuff that we're not afraid to put on the table here at Daylight. But I'd started to I had a blog that thousands of people read, and I was starting to kind of question some of that stuff and just throw questions out there, not even necessarily offering all kinds of answers, but questioning what I had been raised to believe. And the conversation went like this: H, it's good for you to ask these questions. Some of your stances are valid, but if you're going to plant a church, you have to be careful. That's what I was told. And there was this insinuation that if I wanted to raise money for this church plant, I needed to toe the line in order for those with deep pockets to invest. And once again, it was, you're asking the questions that will put you out of community. And that's what I faced for a long portion of my life. And I've been very committed from the very beginning that, and we're not going to get it perfect, but I've been pretty committed that this is not the kind of church we're going to plant. We're going to plant a church where people can come to the table with their questions and not be ostracized. It doesn't mean we're going to all share the right answers or the same answers. It doesn't mean even that you have to agree with what I say from the pulpit. You can question this sermon all you want, and I'm content with that. But what it does mean is we're going to be communal even when we're not. We can have unity without uniformity. Even when we don't have uniformity, we can have unity. We can have a communal collective of people who disagree and love one another anyway. I was actually asked to be on a podcast where the pastors were interviewed as to what they would say to their churches if they were allowed to say it, and it was all in secret, so they didn't mention anybody's names. But one of the speakers, Randy Nye, this is a buddy of mine who runs this podcast, The Pastor and a Philosopher Walk Into a Bar. Randy Nye is on it. He's the pastor. He said this: we're creating this environment that we want this monolithic, very cookie-cutter message. And if we're challenged by it, if we disagree with it, then we don't want to hear it. So I want to talk today about the importance of bursting the bubble, the filter bubbles that you saw in the video. And these filter bubbles we'll talk about in just a minute. We'll define them a little more closely. But what I found was when I started asking good, deep questions and interviewing people and asking my friends about sexuality, when I started thinking deeply about hell, when I started studying cosmology and questioning what I'd always believed about creation, when I started asking the questions without much fear. I want to say much fear because there's always fear of losing community. But when I started asking those questions, it was extremely, extremely liberating for me. And I wrote down some of the effects that I think it had on me, and one was awestruck humility, because I don't know if you know this, but I'm about as humble a person as you'll ever meet. They gave me the reward, but I kept wearing it, so they took it away. That's Paul Lyle's joke. That's not my stuff. My humility demands that I attribute. That's why it's funny. But once I started questioning my take on cosmology and started seeing the universe much bigger than I once did, it was like, there was something that happened when I started to see God as legitimate, not a God that we talk about as being loving but will burn you forever, Those are really, really hard to reconcile. Once I started questioning that and I could see God in all his splendor and his actual love, it was humbling, not humiliating, but humbling. There was a reverence in me that was never there before. There was intellectual solidarity. There was, I don't know why the Y is cut off in solidarity there. That's just bad design. The things that catch my eye, right? But there, all of a sudden, there was like this solidarity between what I thought and what I felt and my relationships and my church community. And the whole thing kind of came together when I gave myself permission to ask hard questions and seek challenging answers. It gave me confidence, and I put fearlessness-ish because I'm not by any means fearless. But I know what I believe nowadays, and I believe it pretty firmly. I know what I don't know fairly well, too, and then I don't know what I don't know at the same time, and I'm really comfortable in this place. There used to be this disconnect. I didn't have intellectual solidarity, so I didn't have confidence. I thought some of this stuff doesn't make sense, but then I'm supposed to believe it just by faith, and that doesn't work for me, and then that affects your relationships, and that affects community as well. And so this intellectual solidarity increased my confidence. And today you can ask me, why do you believe what you believe? And I feel like I can answer that question pretty adequately. Doesn't mean I'm right, doesn't mean I'm certain, but it means I'm confident. And that's a wonderful place to be. And then it allows mercy too. See, when you base your community, when you base your admittance into a structure on having all the right answers, it necessarily diminishes mercy. It means you're on the out, and in some sense it says to the world, I don't care about your thoughts. I don't care about your views. I don't care about your questions. And that's just about as unhealthy as anything gets where Scripture is concerned. And mercy is intimately tied with love. And so when I embrace this idea that questions are not only okay, they're not just tolerated here, but I hope it's really obvious that we embrace them. We love your questions. We want your questions. Questions delineate ownership, and we want you to own your faith. We want you to own your community. And so one of the beauties of starting a church is that you get to start a church. You get to establish your own culture from the beginning. And so you guys hopefully will never tire of seeing this mantra, but no question is off the table. And we wanted to create a church where churched people can sit across the aisle from unchurched people. And hopefully, if you're a churchy person, you have all kinds of questions. Why do we do what we do? Why do we believe what we believe? Why should I believe this? How can I believe this? Hopefully, if you're an unchurched person, you come in exploring, saying, I'm willing to give it a shot. I'm willing to think. And you can fairly easily establish a church for one or the other, but it's pretty challenging to establish a church where people sit across the aisle from each other without banging heads. But that's what we're trying to do here. And I hope whether you have been in the church for a long time, because nobody wants to become the stagnant Christian that just knows it all. It's one thing to be confident. It's another thing to be certain when you shouldn't be certain. And then each of our pillars represent one of the 4 attributes of the Great Commandment. Who can tell me what the Great Commandment is? Heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so our pillar of study represents mind. Pillar of service represents heart, and so forth. We wanted each of our pillars to represent one of those characteristics that we hand over to God. And we want it to be realistic that at Daylight Church you can love God with your mind. There's this old quote that's attributed to C.S. Lewis that C.S. Lewis never actually said, that says the heart cannot rejoice in what the mind rejects as false. And even though it's not from C.S. Lewis, it's still a great quote, and we stick to it. It's hard for your heart to rejoice in what your mind has rejected. And it's hard for your mind to reject something that you haven't explored or thought about. It's hard for your mind to embrace something that you haven't explored or thought about. And so we want to welcome open dialogue and open questioning here. Loving requires knowing, and knowing requires investigation and inquiry. Can I say I love Ryan Murphy if I don't know him at all? I mean, I can from a distance kind of say I'm a loving person, and so I probably love him. I think as a general rule, I want to love people, but can I love him without knowing him? And see, the filter bubble prohibits knowledge. It creates a barrier, not just between ideas, but people with ideas, and thus between people. So the filter bubble is this idea that you're going to keep yourself surrounded by the stuff that you already believe. You're going to create a wall that says, this is what I believe, and if you believe something outside of that wall, I don't want to hear it. And there's some definitions we need to run through to kind of understand exactly what this does to us. One is the echo chamber. The echo chamber is the only voices you hear are the voices you want to hear, or the voices that sound like your own. Then there's what's probably the most well-established idea in all of psychology is that we all exist in a state of what they call confirmation bias. It means we give the thumbs up, and some of the pictures on the internet are so dumb. Like somebody told grandma to go stand in a plant, and I have no idea why. But we want to hear what confirms what we think. We will, even when we hear a varied opinion, we will take that opinion and we will twist it to make it what we want it to say, because we want to stay comfortable. We want to stay secure. And anything that doesn't confirm our biases makes us uncomfortable because of the amygdala and cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is this idea that when we hear something that we disagree with, when we hear something that challenges us, even in this sermon, you may think, well, I love Luther's catechism, and that might raise your hackles a little bit. And I also love Luther's catechism. I've just come to view it a little differently than I once did. But when somebody challenges what you think, then your amygdala fires. This is the best picture of the amygdala that I could find. Your amygdala fires, and it triggers what's called a fight or flight response in you. And so somebody says something about your political party that you disagree with, or something about justice that you disagree with, or something about race or sexuality or all the abortion or the hot topics, and your amygdala fires and flushes you with chemicals, and it's intended to make you run away or fight. And can you love that which triggers you to run away from it or to fight it? If somebody expresses an opinion that is different than your own, and you have this amygdala flush that occurs, can you love them well? And it's challenging to do, and so we have to be people that alter our response, that attack cognitive dissonance, that suppress the amygdala. And the amygdala is important. I mean, don't get me wrong. If this literal animal comes out of the woods, you want your amygdala firing well. But what you don't want is for Paul Lyle to become this animal because he expresses an opinion that you don't like, and so now you don't want to be around him or you want to fight him. Doesn't mean you can't debate him. We'll talk about that as we go. And so we want to be careful about filter bubbles and echo chambers, because filter bubbles and echo chambers are walls designed to keep people out, to suppress the amygdala, because we want to fight or flight those people. And ideas are attached to people often, and we want to be a church where people can come to the table. In the video, it said your timeline is filled with opinions that you share. And we know this about our online virtual selves. So when it says this, we know it's talking about our digital timeline, but I think it goes much deeper than that. Your timeline is what you get from birth to death. And we typically want to fill it with opinions that we share because we want to suppress that amygdala, because we don't want that cognitive dissonance. We don't want to be uncomfortable. But let me tell you, discomfort creates progress. Discomfort can bring people together. It's not something worth fleeing and fighting all the time. There's this amazing book called The Sacredness of Questioning Everything by David Dark. And he says this in it. He says, there's a whisper of revolution whenever people really speak to one another and really listen. To talk about love is to talk about listening. To talk about love is to talk about being heard. He says this. He says, like the God in whose image people are made, people are irreducible. There's always more to a person, more stories, more life, more complexities than we know. The human person, when viewed properly, is unfathomable, incalculable, and dear. And we want to make a space where people can be dear even when they disagree with you. It doesn't mean that every question requires or allows the same amount of time. If somebody comes in here and says, okay, we want a small group on why the earth is round, we're going to say you're wasting our time here. If we want to have somebody that says, well, we're going to start a small group on how gay people ought to be kicked out of the church and beaten, we're not going to waste much time on you. As far as the earth being flat, have you ever watched a ship vanish on the horizon? The mast is the last to go because the earth is round. It's something you can snappy talk about. When it talks about gay people being kicked out of the church, a lot of people would say that's a much more complex question, but if we start talking about violence and bigotry against gay people, we're not going to entertain that stuff. So it doesn't mean that every question that's placed on the table has equal validity. It just means we're willing to meet at the table and talk about stuff. And we'll make that a little more clear as we go. it's important that we say what ideas we make space for affects who we invite to the table. And that's what we're talking about here. We're not just talking about questions being on the table. We're talking about people pulling up a seat and welcoming you and welcoming me to come to the table together and sit across the table from one another and to share a meal together. We put on the back of our shirts, Jesus ate with everyone. We think that encapsulates a lot of the gospel in one very simple expression or phrase. So I want to invite you to get your flex on. And here's what I mean is, questions have power. That's why we've established this question line. That's where a lot of this sermon series is going to come from. The sermon series is the table, and we're tackling questions that you guys have sent in. But questions are quite powerful. So here's this passage of scripture from Jeremiah the prophet, out of Jeremiah chapter 12. It says, "If you have raced with men on foot, and they have worn you out, how can you compete with horses? If you stumble in safe country, how will you manage in the thickets by the Jordan?" What do you guys think this means? Just one or two people. Somebody shout it out. What does this mean? If you stumble in safe country, how will you manage in the thickets by the Jordan? Yeah, today prepares you for tomorrow. Anything else come to mind? Right. Today is the training grounds. And so it's if you can't set an alarm, how do you expect to be CEO? This is important because this sounds a little different than what was coming from the back of the room. And this is the point exactly. Whit is owning it differently than Jordan or Nancy did. But you're owning it. Now, I could have gotten up here and said to you, you got to prepare for the big stuff. And that might have gone in one ear and out the other. But when I read this question to you and I allow you to process the meaning of the question and answer the question, now all of a sudden you own it. It becomes yours. And we want you to walk a journey at Daylight Church. And I believe Jesus wants you to walk a journey where you own this thing, where it is actually your walk of faith and not something else somebody has spoon-fed you. And that's the power of questions. And you see questions all throughout Scripture. Nicodemus says to Jesus, "How can this be?" Jesus gives him a teaching on being born again. And says a person must be born again to see the kingdom of God. And he says, how can a baby enter his mother's womb for that? I don't get it. But Nicodemus is owning the moment. And Jesus went on to talk to him. God says to Job, he says, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth?" So Job has all these questions for God, and God comes back with a question of his own and says, "You really think you're something, don't you? Where were you when the foundations of the earth were laid? Where were you when the oceans were told to go so far and not much further?" And what is the meaning of his question? You might be forgetting who God is in this moment. But he's not saying to Job, you might be forgetting who God is in this moment. He's asking Job a question, so Job will process that on his own, chew it up, ruminate on it, and come to his own solution, and thus own it and be transformed. Pilate says to Jesus, "What is truth?" Jesus says, "If you love those who love you, what credit is it to you?" Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" Jesus taught in parables a lot, and we find out that his parables were meant to instigate questions. His disciples said, "Why do you teach in parables?" And his answer is basically, well, if they knew, then they'd know, and somehow that's a problem. So Jesus somehow thinks the process of coming to the conclusion is just as or more important than coming to the conclusion. There's this one parable where Jesus talks about the Good Samaritan. Somebody came to Jesus and said, "What's the number one law?" And he said, "You love your neighbor as yourself." And then the lawyer says to him, "Who is my neighbor?" And Jesus says, "Well, let me tell you a story about the most abhorrent, awful person you could think of." And it turns out that that's the hero of the story. And Jesus follows up with, "Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" So he doesn't just tell the story that's meant to bring a lot of questions. How can a Samaritan be the hero of the story? What are you talking about, Jesus? But then he doesn't even answer the question. He follows up with his own question and makes the lawyer say it out loud, makes him own it. And so creating an environment where no question is off the table is also creating an environment of ownership, of personal faith and growth. And so when we talk about the table, we're talking about pulling up a seat and asking. And I just have some random thoughts about what the table looks like. And Jesus brought zealots and tax collectors to the table together. You can bet those were interesting conversations. He brought priests and prostitutes to the same table. He brought Jews and Gentiles to the same table. He brought eunuchs, and whatever the opposite of a eunuch is, I don't know what it is. I try to think about it, and I don't have a word for it. I don't even know what your answer was. But you can bet these were interesting conversations. And Jesus wasn't afraid of those conversations. And let me tell you, sitting across the table from somebody that you disagree with or that you can't relate to or it would be hard to integrate into your life is scary. But let me tell you this as well. Love is always, always dangerous. Love is always, always dangerous. You have to put yourself on the line to love well. And it may be uncomfortable to sit across the table from somebody you disagree with. It may be uncomfortable to raise your hands in worship right down the aisle from somebody who also is raising their hands in worship, and you just know you don't like them much. And they probably don't like you as well. But that's a place where love can meet. That's a place where people can meet and love one another. So bring them together. And remember this, you are at the table, and you're awful. And I am at the table, and I am awful. And I don't even agree with who I was 10 years ago. I don't even like much who I was 15 years ago. What am I going to think about the guy that's preaching this sermon today 20 years from now, if I make it that long? Just understand we're all messes. The table has to be messy as soon as you put one person at it, much less 2 people and 3 people and 30 people. So embrace the mess. Allow the mess. Enjoy the mess. Remember the 3 C's, convinced, confident, and certain. In my opinion, there's this line of stuff in your head, or in my head. And on one side of the line, I'll call it the left side, but then all you liberals think, yeah, he's in my camp. And that's not what I mean at all. If I say the right side, then the conservatives go, ha, 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 gotcha. So there's this line that has neither left nor right. And on one end of the line is certainty. And in my opinion, the stuff that gets categorized there, should be a very small list. It's I think, therefore I am. And that's about it. And then further in, you find stuff that you feel really, really confident about. I feel really confident in the theory of gravity, and I think I can illustrate it right now scientifically. There's stuff that I feel really, really confident about. Then there's stuff that I'm not certain of, I feel confident about, I feel convinced of, but not quite as confident about. And I would say categories of faith, categories of religion, my relationship with Jesus, my relationship with Scripture, all fall in that category of confident but uncertain, of convinced but uncertain. And I think it's fair, and it's the only way to have intellectual integrity is to allow for that reality, to be expressive of that reality. Now, we live in a Christian culture that puts belief and behavior over belonging every single time, and so I must be certain. I must be certain. The only way for my wife to be healed of leukemia is if I'm sure that God is going to touch her, so I have to fight. I have to believe for sure. I can't allow doubt. I can't allow questions, because if I allow questions, then that diminishes my faith, and she won't be healed, and it'll be my fault. And then when she gets sicker, then it was my fault because I wasn't confident enough. I wasn't certain enough. And this is a mess that pervades Christianity. Instead, I have confidence in what I've learned. I have confidence in Jesus. Certainty can be an idol. One of you wrote in, what if truth and certainty don't exist? This happens to be one of the easiest questions to face and one of the deepest questions if you really, really want to dive into it and take some mushrooms that you ought not be taking. Anything contrary to this is what's called a self-defeating statement. So if I say truth does not exist, I have uttered a truth that truth does not exist. There's a logical fallacy built into answering this question in the negative that makes it impossible to counter, or makes it impossible to come against. Truth exists because there's no other way to state anything but that. Not what we're going to spend our time on today, and I don't even really remember why I was bringing it up. But it can be a deep question if you're asking, how do we know we don't live in the Matrix? We're all machines plugged into some supercomputer, and this is all an illusion. And to answer that, I really have no idea what the answer is, except to say you work with what you got. And so there's stuff that is easy to counter. There's stuff to be certain of. I am certain truth is that which corresponds to reality because it's baked into the definition, and the definition is undeniable. Now, am I certain of everything that I touch and taste and smell? No. but I'm pretty confident in it because it's all I got to work with. I want to say let them fire. And what I mean by that is live in a state where you allow your amygdala to kick off every now and then. Does anybody want to live a life of humdrum, boredom, and unexcitement? No. Nobody wants to live that life. And yet we suppress our amygdala and suppress the opportunity to enter into that. The bungee jumping of the intellectual life, we just don't allow. And it's much, much safer than actual bungee jumping, so I encourage it. And so, what is the purpose of church? My friend Meg and I were talking about that on the way here. Is the purpose of church to come and be comfortable? Or is the purpose of the church to come and be convinced, to be uncomfortable, to be challenged? And I think there's a mix between the two. There's some hybrid location in between. But I'm saying, go to a church that will challenge you. Go to a church where, well, let me put it like this. In that podcast that came out recently, he said, we're creating this monolithic culture. But how he led that off was interesting, and I didn't share it with you earlier, and I will now. He says, this is the tragedy of the American church. We pastors feel like we have to tell our people what they want to hear already. And I'm just being as transparent as I can be right now. This is clearly and irreconcilably connected to the offering. The sustainability of church. Pastors feel like they have to say what people already think, because if they don't, people will get offended and walk out the door. And if they walk out the door, it's connected to their checkbook. And the checkbook is connected to keeping the lights on and keeping food in their kids' bellies. And I don't know what the answer to that is, because in some sense, church, the performance thing that we do on stage and come together on Sundays, in some sense, is a business. But I'm just going to throw it out there that it's a challenge for pastors. It's a challenge to think, and it has to do with their board members and who will agree with them, who will fire them. I established our bylaws where y'all can't fire me unless I start sleeping with my secretary, who happens to be my wife, so it works out really well. But we're going to tackle some really tough stuff, and you're going to hear things that you disagree with. How will you behave and how will you respond? We're going to talk about Christians and bigotry. We just sent out a mailer to 10,000 people that live right around our community that just says Christian bigots on the front. That's all it says, which I thought was great. I thought about putting a question on it, but I thought, no, we're just going to say it. We're going to talk about the Bible being God's word and which parts do we embrace and which parts do we we're all going to cherry pick. How do we decide which parts we adhere to and which parts we don't? And why should we believe this thing came from God when it was written by men, and even worse, compiled by men later? And some of the books were not accepted into the canon. And what do we do with all this information? And that's going to make you uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable to preach it. I've asked my staff to cover for me a lot over the next few weeks because I just want to focus on sermon prep entirely. We're going to talk about universalism and soteriology. What does it mean to be saved? Who is saved? Do people go to hell forever? And that sort of thing. And these are questions that you guys have sent in, and there will be offense. There's no place on the spectrum I can land on some of these questions without offending someone. But will you embrace a church that's willing to put this stuff on the table and willing to bring people of various views to the table and slide seats up together and sit across from one another and have a meal together? And only you know the answer to that, and only you and God know the answer as to whether you should or should not even be here. But that's between you and God. I want to encourage you to own your own journey. I'm going to have to fly here. The scriptures encourage us to test everything and hold fast what is good. Well, there's a passage that no pastor wants said on a Sunday morning very often. You preach a sermon, and man, you brought the house down. It's so good, and then you say at the end, but why listen to me? That's not what you want to follow up with, right? But Paul's saying that. Saying, don't listen to your pastor, listen to you and God, and let your pastor be a part of that process. Don't just buy into what I tell you because I'm the guy on the platform with a really horrible podium that doesn't, Own your own faith, and that requires question. It requires inquiry. Opinions are important, but well-informed, well-contested, and well-thought-out opinions are treasure. But I'm going to put my cards on the table because community requires some kind of barriers or boundaries. There's a reason we gather here at Daylight instead of at the Elks Club down the street or the bar down the road or a different church or a different religion entirely. You guys have chosen to come to Daylight for some reason. And hopefully part of that reason is because we are a church that offers or allows any question at the table. But I want to lay my cards on the table to tell you what you can expect from the pulpit, what you can expect from my leadership team. And it's stuff that is not beyond question, but it's just to say that if you're uncomfortable with these dialogues, this is a place you're probably going to be uncomfortable. But we believe in the basic creeds, the Nicene and Apostolic creeds. We believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, and so forth. The ancient theology of basic Christianity. That's what you're going to hear from us. You're going to hear about the great commands, that the entire law is summed up in loving God and loving others. The Imago Dei, that we're all created in the image of God and thus have intrinsic, unestimable worth. We're never going to get away from that here. We can question it, but the odds of being converted on that topic are not very good. Cruciform faith. We believe the cross and Jesus are the center of all good theology. And that's what you're going to hear from this pulpit. Center set theology as opposed to bounded set theology, which you can look up on your own. And then you're going to hear God is here a lot. We don't think God is distant and far away, but we think he's close and intimate. And this is the stuff you're going to hear from the pulpit at Daylight Church and probably across the board from our leadership. We may vary on it a little bit, but this is the stuff you can expect. I want you to remember the 3 B's and ask yourself, how will you behave when your beliefs are challenged? 3 B's are beliefs, belonging, and behavior. And so many churches prioritize these poorly, and we're at Daylight Church are going to prioritize belonging over belief and behavior, which is not to diminish belief and behavior as to be unimportant, except to say that belonging is where it's at. Belonging is the hill that we're going to die on. I'm trying to fly here. Don't be the fiddler. In the movie Fiddler on the Roof, there's this guy, he's listening to an argument between friends, and he says, hey, you're right, to one guy. He hears his argument, he says, hey, he's right. And then the other guy makes his argument, and he says, hey, you're right. And then one of the guys says, we can't be both right. And he says, you're right. You can be so open-minded that you never embrace anything. And that's not what we're espousing here either. We're just espousing critically challenged opinions. And like we said, well-informed, well-contested, and well-thought-out opinions. I want you to remember this meme where he says, he's out of line, but he's right. Winsome is a word and an important word. There is a place for turning over tables and getting angry and pounding your fist. And I don't want to say that there's never a place for that, but you will see this. In Jesus' life, when he turned over the tables, here's what, go read it. He goes into the temple, he looks around, he leaves the temple, he spends the night in weeping prayer, he returns to the temple and overthrows the tables. This was not a violent, emotional, unthought-out response that Jesus had. It was something premeditated and processed. So there is a place for pounding the pulpit. There is a place for restraining people. There is a place for becoming angry about terrible ideology. But there's also a behavioral way to handle those things that requires the shalom of God and the peace of God. And so be careful about how you present truth. Questions beget questions, which means you're going to have questions, and those questions are going to bring other questions, and that's all good, and that's all okay. I'm going to skip some stuff and close with this. Romans 12 tells us this. It tells us about the mind. It says, do not conform to the pattern of this world. What is the pattern of this world? Echo chambers and filter bubbles. The pattern of this world is you're on the outside, I'm on the inside, I'm staying here, you please keep your distance. Don't be conformed to that. And there's other patterns of the world, too, that could be integrated in this passage, too. It's not the only way to look at it. It says, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. Do you see the questions that are baked into that simple statement? You're testing and approving what God's will is. In order to test and approve, what do you have to do? You have to ask questions. It's his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So somehow, arriving at God's will requires a change in the way you think, and a change in the way you think requires looking at stuff, looking at the world, looking at ideas and theology and so forth, or people and their ideas, and saying, I wonder about that. And God gives us permission to do that. In the video, it said this stuff has the power to make us more connected or more isolated than ever. And so I want to encourage you over the next few weeks. Next week is Mother's Day. I'm not preaching on the table next week. We're doing something different for Mother's Day. But after that, we're going to dive into these difficult questions. And when we do that, I encourage you to pull up a seat at the table and allow yourself to question, because I believe that will result in awestruck humility, a closer walk with intellectual solidarity, confidence and fearlessness-ish, and mercy and love.